I've enjoyed the story of Dragonflight, too. I enjoyed it a great deal. Obviously, they're trying to replace a game that generationally has not put as much effort into telling a big, single, like, robust narrative storytelling with lots of, like, visuals and lots of voice acting and all these things. That's something they've had to iterate on over the years. As opposed to Final Fantasy tried doing that starting 10 years ago in 2013. And so they've been able to do a lot more. And they come from a background of a storytelling RPG studio as opposed to a background from a more like mechanical RTS and things like that studio. So like, it's just different. Dragonflight seems to be an iteration on Shadowlands more than on just directly Final Fantasy XIV. And Shadowlands seems to be picking up off of story beats seen in the Woven campaigns of like the War campaign in BFA. The War campaign seems to take aspects of the way they told stories across Warlords of Draenor and Legion. So like, they didn't just like not have any story and then just suddenly had a main campaign. It's been a series of steps to get there. And absolutely they're aware of other games along the way, but like sometimes I see people think like they just reached into this other game and just like grabbed it and just dropped it and then there it is. And like, I don't think that happened at all. I think they have writers on staff that have been doing things like writing books. They have books that support World of Warcraft. Those are obviously stories. So like clearly they understand the concept of writing as a task, you know? They just didn't insert it as heavily into the game and left it in books as a medium, which in the lore interview, I think it was with Denuser, he talked about like letting each medium speak for itself. And so they've typically felt that stories that are best told in books should be in books. And that's something that's frustrated a lot of players because it means that sometimes it feels like, you know, I can't speak for these players because I've been a story skipper in WoW. That's how I've always enjoyed it. But like the general impression that I get is that people tell me they have tried to find the story in game and it's not there. And that's because they said, if it's better told in a book, we'll leave it in a book instead of poorly telling it over here. And so if you picture like Game of Thrones as both a TV show and a book, some people prefer one over the other, but it is present in both places. And it feels like the community has said that there are portions of the story that because they are better told in a book, they are only in a book. And they just skip over those events in the game. And Dragonflight doesn't feel like that. That could absolutely be augmented with books. We could focus on all sorts of like behind the scenes motivations and all these different things, hear inner monologues and all these things that like games don't do well. That's fine. But there was a cohesive story and I felt that I enjoyed every step of the way. And Shadowlands I felt was trying to tell me that. I just didn't know how to engage. Like I just didn't know how to... I tried and I didn't know how. As opposed to Dragonflight, if your ears were open and you were listening for a story, there was a story being told. Shadowlands, I tried opening my ears and like I didn't know how to receive it. As somebody that was not caught up with the lore going into it, it was not told in a way where I could grasp it. Dragonflight was told in a way where if you didn't know who the Dragonflights were, they told you. If you didn't know who Nor's Domu was, they told you. And so, like, at every stage, they said, like, don't worry about it. I got you. You're here to enjoy a story, and that's good enough. No prerequisites, no freshman WoW 101 class required. You can just come here and enjoy the game, and that's okay. Obviously, Stormblood has the advantages of being able to pick up off of Heavensward and ARR. So it has this big, strong foundation. And so... not having to spend time explaining an Aetheryte or who the Garleans are allows them to tell these really personal stories. So I got to focus on helping a kid put flowers on his parents' graves. And that was made possible by the fact that I don't have questions like, where the hell is Othard? Right? And so, like, not judging for execution, not judging for the quality, WoW has tried to tell stories. Whether you like them or not, that's your own opinion and that's fine. But they have tried to tell stories. My fault is not, are they aware that a story has a beginning, middle, and end and that they should be told? they seem to be on the same page as that. So, like, I'm not going to sit here and say, like, oh, like, 14 versus, wow, like, one is better. That starts to feel, like, really, really childish if that's the only way we can look at it. Because it just tends to be, like, one name-calling the other. It's also not fun to pick on somebody for something they can't fix. It's not fun. Like, it's fun to make fun of my brother who's better at shooters than me when I get more kills than him in a round. It's fun to say, wow, bro, where are you at, man? I don't even see you up here at the top of the leaderboard. And that's fun because I know he can beat me next game. It's not fun to make fun of him for the fact that he wears glasses. That's stupid. It's just mean. That's all it is. Or for him to make fun of the fact that I can't eat dairy. There's nothing I can do about that. I didn't choose it. It's just me. So there's no fun in that. So if you pick fun at WoW for its storytelling, in my opinion, that should come from a place of being aware that A, they have told stories in the past, whether you liked them or not. And B, that in those stories there are good moments. Which means that you are picking on them from a point of, I do believe World of Warcraft could tell a story. If you truly believe that World of Warcraft should never, ever, ever be allowed to have good story, and that it sucks, and it's irredeemable, and I don't know how even people try it, and like story at all, and when somebody says, hey, I want to get into the lore of WoW, all you do is laugh at them, that just feels mean. Because from that perspective, you're arguing that there is no saving WoW. And I hear that. People just say it's this hopeless case, that there is nothing that Blizzard could do to ever change their perspective on Blizzard, or on World of Warcraft, or on monetization, or on storytelling, or whatever. It's this irredeemable. It's this life sentence. And if it's a life sentence without parole, that's this unforgivable, irredeemable game, then it's effectively a death penalty. It doesn't matter. There is no learning. There is no growing. There is no moving forward. And so, like, I personally do think that, like, a lot of what you guys bring up are very good points about how World of Warcraft could get better. But all of that is from a place of, I acknowledge that they have had successes in the past, and I believe that many of the areas they are not succeeding are well within their reach. Could Dragonflight tell a good story by the time it is at completion, when we go into 11.0? Yes. Yes, wholeheartedly. And in order to do that, I do want to be really aware of some timelines. The other day, somebody said that Mythic Plus came from fractals. So Mythic Plus, added to WoW. Mythic Plus was a new 5-man mode that allowed you to run mythic versions of dungeons as an endlessly increasing take on challenge modes. Mythic Plus first entered World of Warcraft in patch 7.0.3, which was Legion. But challenge modes were basically single line mythics. So challenge modes were previewed at BlizzCon in 2011, and effectively there was just 3 times you could get for completing a dungeon: bronze, silver, and gold. And once you could get gold, there was nothing beyond that. So it was not endless. So Mythic Plus was meant to be an upgrade to the challenge mode, which was in Pandaria, I believe, from BlizzCon 2011. So BlizzCon 2011, right here, they announced challenge modes, which means they've been working on them internally, and they were introduced to the game as part of the Mist of Pandaria faction expansion, which took place from 2012 to 2014. So challenge modes is where Mythic Plus came from. Could they have learned from Guild Wars along the way? Absolutely. But the question is, did Mythic Plus come from Fractals? Exclusively, exhaustively. This idea that it is picked up and just dropped in and taken. Fractals are a special type of dungeon that is an array of mini dungeons where each fractal has its own story and environment. You'll be adjusted to level 80 and you will ascend. You will take ascended equipment, infusing it with agony resist to allow you to work through higher and higher difficulties that begin at 1 and end at 100. They are in their own dedicated area, and you run those. They work a lot like Mythic Plus. Okay? That is how fractals work. It sounds like Mythic Plus. It sounds a lot like Mythic Plus. When were they added? Fractals of the Mist was part of the Lost Shores release November 16th, 2012. According to the Guild Wars wiki. Date added. 2012. Huh, that's weird. So, World of Warcraft picked up and stole fractals, which were released to the public from 2012 to 2016, and they implemented them beginning at BlizzCon in 2011. Because what they really did was they made Diablo Rifts out of challenge mode. And Diablo Rifts, I think, were available not long after launch. So, games learn from each other. I don't disagree with that. Are there elements of fractals that are now seen in Mythic Plus that maybe weren't there along the way? Probably. Probably. So, are there things about World of Warcraft that were learned from Final Fantasy XIV? I would hope so. There is no reason for every one of these games, Guild Wars, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, to have to learn and invent everything themselves. They are worked on by developers who like games. I hope they are aware of what other games are doing and are saying, are there things that they're doing that would work for us? Are there things they're doing that would not work for us? They tried something that we've been interested in. Are there things about that we want to avoid? Are there things about that that make us want to lean into that further? How do we take the lessons they've learned and implement them into our own universe? Not by just picking them up and dropping them, but by making them ours. And I think that's fine. And so there is this idea that World of Warcraft's Dragonflight story can only be good. The only way is if they exclusively and exhaustively decided that Dragonflight, released November, learned from Final Fantasy XIV, which really hit its stride publicly. It's been doing great things for a long time, beginning in 2019. Which, for perspective, there is a very real chance that internal discussions for Dragonflight had already begun before Shadowbringers released. Because that's how far in advance these things work. We know that that is industry typical, and we know that that is true of World of Warcraft based on the most recent interviews, especially the ones with Preach. So we know that. So did they learn from Final Fantasy? I would hope so. But like, Final Fantasy is not the only MMORPG with a story that people enjoy. I've heard great things about Star Wars. I've really been enjoying my time in Guild Wars. And actually, there's a lot of things about the way that Dragonflight tells a story that don't feel like a Final Fantasy story. Final Fantasy XIV just put a ton of emphasis on a child and her older brother. Does World of Warcraft have some intimate stories? Yeah. But it feels bigger. And so in many ways, it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy story. It's not as intimate. I don't feel like I'm in people's brains, experiencing their emotions. So if it stole from Final Fantasy, I don't think it did a great job. I think it may have learned from it, but actually there's a ton of things where, like, for her to tell me a story, I have to meet her somewhere. And WoW has me walking with people who have these dialogue bubbles and all this voice acting. Dragonflight did a lot of things that I actually think Final Fantasy could learn from, which is crazy. I do think that from a total narrative development point, Final Fantasy's knocking it out of the park. But mechanically, the way they tell the story, there's a lot of awkwardness that still happens in Endwalker, where somebody says, I'll catch you up on the way. And then they talk to you for a bit, and then they teleport and talk to you for a bit. Now, Endwalker added some tools to try to help it make it feel like there's these checkpoints along the way, but it doesn't feel like you're walking and talking like you would with a friend. But Guild Wars and World of Warcraft both do that unbelievably well. They take you into these little moments, and it feels like somebody's talking to you. And even if I peel off from somebody that's walking with me and I decide to go fight this Hornbill, they're going to be standing next to me continuing to tell a story, which means that I am allowed to play a video game while receiving narrative. Final Fantasy feels like I play a video game, I hear narrative. I play a video game, I hear narrative. And I'm in one camp or I'm in the other. I'm in one camp or I'm the other. For the first 2 hours of Endwalker, I honestly don't think I killed a single thing. Not one. Not one piece of combat. From a storytelling standpoint, that 2 hours was a masterpiece. I think I'd already cried twice. It was incredible. Incredible. From a, is it a video game standpoint, not a great start. You like the combat system? Don't worry about that. You're not going to need that. I heard a thing about like the global cooldown with this game. Not going to be in effect. How much gear do I need? Not an issue. What class should I start Endwalker as? Not an issue. You're not actually going to kill anything. I think there is a very real chance that Estinian spends more time talking about overpriced hair ties in the first 2 to 2.5 hours of Endwalker than I spend in combat. So to say that World of Warcraft learned from Final Fantasy, if they want to get better at telling stories, their narrative team should be playing Final Fantasy XIV. But their narrative team, when they sit down and talk to the team that's going to implement this in-game and is going to break it into the 204 quests that Dragonflight contains. By the way, Stormblood's 122 quests, Dragonflight's 200 quests. 200 quests. Do you want to see them? Here's how Dragonflight's broken down. Tell me that this is Final Fantasy. Did their writing team suddenly start getting better at responding to games like Final Fantasy? I hope so, but I hope they also went and played other good narrative games, which means they might have played single-player games. That would be okay. They broke Dragonflight into 4 zones. They will be adding more zones in future patches based on past expansions. Does that sound like Final Fantasy? No, it doesn't. 4 base zones with more zones added with the patches. You're saying they learned from Final Fantasy XIV. Should the writing team have been aware of Final Fantasy XIV? Yes. Should the music team learn about Final Fantasy XIV? My God, yes. A bunch of chapters in the front zone to set the expansion up, followed by effectively 3 to 4 chapters in each of the remaining zones. And then post MSQ, there are faction lines that will play out slowly as you do dailies with each of the 4 factions. They break those quests into brief little quests that are very quick, very rapid, and are laden with cutscenes and tons and tons and tons of voice acting. These quests are typically, in my opinion, not nearly as intimate as what Final Fantasy would put within a main scenario quest. And the intimate stories, as far as a child who wants help finding flowers for their parents' grave, would instead be found in these side stories, which are separate from the 204 campaign quests. That is a different way of telling a story than Final Fantasy. which does have side quests, but a lot of the side quests are kill 10 things. And the main story is much denser, because it has the big moments, the Garleans are here to invade, and the little moments. I need help finding flowers for my parents' grave. And they're both in there. High highs, low lows, all in one place. And while there are brief moments of that in Dragonflight, a lot of it felt like side quests. Along the path to those Oathstones, you need to help the various people of the Dragon Isles align with your sides, because the people that are against you acquiring the Oathstones are all going to end up over here, and you guys are all going to end up over there. And we are going to duke it out. And this ends and culminates in a big cliffhanger that will be paid off with the raid. And the final boss of the raid is the big bad that all of this built to. That is not how Final Fantasy tells stories. It's not at all. So the idea that for Dragonflight to have redeeming narrative value, it has to be a Final Fantasy clone, is A, insulting to Final Fantasy. That what they do is so easy to pick up and copy pasta that WoW just has to look at it and go, yoink. B, it is insulting to every game that is not Final Fantasy that also does a great job. Insert whatever your favorite story is. Single player, other MMOs, I've been enjoying Guild Wars alongside these two. Whatever. You like a story in ESO? Great. You played Star Wars? Whatever, that's fine. Nope, they're not good. If they got good at story, the only way they could have done it is Final Fantasy, and that's not fair. And last of all, it's insulting to World of Warcraft because it implies that the only way they're capable of doing something well is it has to be a carbon copy of somebody else. It cannot be their own take. And what World of Warcraft has done well over the years has been, yes, look to what other people are doing, be heavily influenced and heavily inspired. But they are not just stealing and drop shipping it as some Etsy store that says it's handmade, but it comes out of a shipping container. What they are doing is they are taking something that's in one game and they are refining it. What World of Warcraft has done as its unique strength is it has made an enormous number of things widely acceptable. There are people that played World of Warcraft that not only played other MMORPGs, but there are people that played World of Warcraft that before that had never played video games. So if it was as simple as going to the game store and just picking up any game, every game would have players like that. But that is something that World of Warcraft does better than most other games on the market. And you can rip it for being too widely appealing, it suits for casuals or whatever, I don't care. I'm just telling you that's something that has been their strength. Are there weaknesses to that? Yes, everything has pros and cons. But that has been something that has made World of Warcraft very, very good over the years. And it's the reason why they can burn so many players and make so many people mad and still have such a large active subscriber base, because their subscriber base grows. They bring in new players. Somebody somewhere is on their very first time in World of Warcraft today. I don't care what day I film this, I don't care what day you watch this, it's true. As opposed to Final Fantasy, my top MMO in my life, which asks that if you do not clear 300 MSQ quests, you are not a welcome member of the community. We'll let you try the first several hundred for free, yes, but if you quit along the way and say it's not good, keep it to yourself. It's really hard to grow a base like that. Do I think it's worth it being on the other side? Yes. But I think that from being on the other side, we're asking new players to take that out of blind faith. That's insane. So World of Warcraft's story is not a Final Fantasy story. It's not nearly as intimate, and its major story beats are A, it does not utilize its dungeons, which is super weird. Are there invitations to go run the dungeons? Absolutely. There's like 1 to 3 quests for every dungeon that kind of tell you. But you could run the dungeon before you do the quests, and you could do the quests and do all the other quests in the zone and ignore the dungeon. That's weird. That is weird. That is a mistake. Final Fantasy takes its dungeons and inserts them into the story. Now the beauty is they have the trust system, so that does not derail the single player experience. World of Warcraft only has that in their Exile's Reach zone, so they would need to bring that on board, but it is weird to me that the dungeons are totally independent of the core required lore. Does somebody like Novel 87 build them in? Sure. But they are not required. And that's weird. However, To somebody that wants to experience the full campaign story of World of Warcraft, the raid is required? Because this last moment, Big Time Adventurer, basically this chapter wraps up and says, next time on World of Warcraft Z. And that's it. And then it just ends. No satisfaction. No big credit rolls. That was incredible. I'm not crying, you're crying moment like Final Fantasy. None of that. It ends setting up the raid, which was not even launched the same day. So then, to go deal with our big bad villain, I have to go into large group content after you wrote a story that does not use small group content. That's weird. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, bakes in dungeons and 8-man trials. You get a low, medium, and high level trial baked into the core story. But you also get dungeons along the way. Lots of group content. So for the fact that people say Final Fantasy story is single player, it's a single player game, and sometimes people might treat it like an MMO. No, it's not. It's not Final Fantasy 15 with an optional multiplayer. If you want to have a full experience with Final Fantasy 14, at the very least, you will run every single expansion. You will run the mandatory trials with 7 strangers. And to get through ARR, to get to the other side, you have to run 24 mans. You will play with other players. And the trust and duty support system has massively cut down on the number of times you'll have to do it if you don't want to, but you will still do it. There is no offline play for Final Fantasy XIV. They're just different. They're different storytelling. Did I like Dragonflight? Yes, but not because it copied Final Fantasy, because it didn't. It is its own thing. I hope they learned from other games and didn't have to sit around and spend time and resources thinking of how to tell a good story. But they did not carbon copy anybody. And I think that some of their weaknesses, like the fact they didn't leverage their dungeons and they did require their raid to get a complete experience, are mistakes. I think those are mistakes. I think it's weird. I like that Final Fantasy tells an adjacent story for its raids and Alliance Raid series. It builds on the world, but it is separate. I like that. But I also think they did some things that Final Fantasy could learn from. I think the amount of voice acting in Dragonflight was unbelievable. Unbelievable. And some of it was very good. I think the music is fine, but Final Fantasy makes music almost feel like it should be credited as one of the characters. So I think Final Fantasy did some things well, but when they tell story, there's not nearly enough voice acting for how intimate things are, especially when they choose to reveal a character off screen and they show question mark, question mark, question mark, and you do not have your imagination turn for a moment. In a book, there would be descriptors of that voice. You hear footsteps behind you. A gruff voice says in a dull roar, right? From afar, you hear a high-pitched scream, urgently shouting. You get something. And that starts to clue you in on tone and intensity and possibly things like gender and age, which our ears are attuned to hear. They are attuned to pick that up. There are overlaps between the male and female vocal range, but because of the way we pronounce words and things like that, you start to get a feel for maybe where they're from. You get all these things, this information feeds in, and so you begin to form a picture of them. And then when you turn around, maybe that's confirmed. Maybe that's totally subverted. Have you ever seen a picture of your favorite podcaster or radio host? They look nothing like what you've shaped because you've listened to hours of their voice, and it's gone from forming a gentle shadow of I think they're tall or short or big or small to you built a face. And it's not their face. It never is. And that moment is part of it. And Final Fantasy doesn't do that. And for a game that has the ability to show intense facial expression where World of Warcraft does not because of graphical and model forming choices, that's a missed opportunity. And voice acting when they introduce characters could be a lot better. And to make the world feel like a physical place, the visual storytelling in both these games could improve, but in Final Fantasy could really improve. When somebody says, I want to show you around town, you go to visit a friend, and they say, hey, we're going to drive by downtown on the way back from the airport. Let me point out a couple of cool things. You see that building over there? Here's a little story about it. You see that park down there? Here's what happened last time I was there. You see that concert hall over there? We're going to go to that next Tuesday and see a game or something. Right? But they don't quietly sit in the car with you and not talk for 10 minutes and then exit the highway and pull up to the base of that building and then say, now I'm talking to you. And then get in the car and quietly drive for 10 minutes to the park and say, ah, that's weird. And yet that's how Final Fantasy tells stories. They don't tell stories as you go. Even in Endwalker, with this new escort system, it still feels like run, talk, run, talk, run, talk, run, talk, run, talk. There are very, very, very rare exceptions. They might talk to you when you're riding in the hippo cart. Maybe. Something like that. So you can point out your 2 exceptions below. Let me know. Somewhere I'm wrong. That's fine. But in World of Warcraft, this is happening in every single zone. In Guild Wars, this is happening during every part of stories. When a boss is voiced in a dungeon in Final Fantasy, it catches me off guard. The vast majority of bosses in Final Fantasy are not voiced. And yet in World of Warcraft, they are. They're characters. So for a game that doesn't have its mandatory dungeons, which I think is dumb, they have a lot of voice acting. And that allows them to do things like tell you stories in the middle of combat, tell you stories as you cover distance. New World does this. As you go across the zone and you interact with these hidden runes, the hidden runes are read to you as you walk to the next rune. So there's things that I think Final Fantasy could learn from World of Warcraft. And that's not saying, oh, you're saying World of Warcraft's better than Final Fantasy. No, you should be able to learn from people. We could take objective measures of certain systems in these games and try to call one better, and that's fine. And maybe overall you like one game substantially better, and that's fine. But what I'm talking about here is, did World of Warcraft steal something from Final Fantasy? Did they only have a story that people are enjoying in Dragonflight because it was straight up lifted out of Final Fantasy? And before that, Shadowlands was not rejoiced for story. Go watch the Jesse Cox video. And yet, when you look at the way this game told story, are there elements of it that feel like they're out of Final Fantasy if you're a Final Fantasy player? Yes. Are there elements of it that feel like you're out of Guild Wars if you're a Guild Wars player? Yup. But what if you were only a WoW player? Was Dragonflight unfamiliar? Did WoW players who had only ever played WoW, it's the only video game they've ever played in their life, were they lost? No. Why? If this was stolen from another MMO, how'd they know how to do it? So I am not saying at all that World of Warcraft didn't learn from these other games, but it is not as simple as they did not have a thing and they went out and just took somebody else's. I didn't own any shoes, I stole your shoes, I used to just wear socks everywhere, but now I'm just gonna wear your shoes around. These games are living, breathing documents. All 3 of the games I'm talking about are over 10 years old. They've all been doing something. They've all tried PvP, they all have dungeons, they all have raids, they all have story. It's been great to see World of Warcraft close the gap on Final Fantasy in the quality of story they've told within Azeroth. I think that's fair. They have. To say that Final Fantasy is out in front of the race and that World of Warcraft needs to draft on some people and catch up, absolutely. Absolutely they do. But to say that they weren't even in the race and they just looked at Final Fantasy and said, oh, story. Well, let me go to the MMO story store and pick one of those up. I didn't know those were important. I'll just go buy one, and my very first one will be good. That's not fair to the devs that made it possible. I think there's very real work that took place at Blizzard to make the Dragonflight story possible. And it also isn't fair to the Final Fantasy team that implies that what they do could just be copied by going to the MMO story store. I'm just picking that up. It's not true. What Ishikawa brings to Final Fantasy XIV is not copyable. You can read everything she's ever written. You cannot do what she does. She's not the only good writer, she's just the one that people know. Because she is unbelievably talented. So Final Fantasy XIV is my main MMO, but I have been enjoying the story of World of Warcraft, and I have been enjoying the story of Guild Wars. And what I like about World of Warcraft and Guild Wars is that I get to take the story on when I want. I can log in and just play the game if I just want to play the game, and I can do story if I want to do story. So I think making the campaign mandatory for World of Warcraft, as it's become more and more and more of it is mandatory, frustrated a lot of players who just wanted to play WoW. Thankfully, they made it very easy to enjoy on alts. Great job. And thankfully, a lot of the intimate stories that I wouldn't want to feel like I had to rush through were tied to side stories. And I think that's good. I do. I think that's good. And I hope all 3 games and other games outside of those are looking to each other, looking outside the genre. There's other great stories being told in gaming. And I'm glad that WoW is ready to enter the arena of having a strong story presented in-game that people can be proud of and can enjoy who like it. I was playing WoW this weekend with a friend who was just skipping his way through everything but the cutscenes, and he was having a blast. And if the cutscene said something that didn't make sense, he just made up the in-between details. And I loved his version, and I didn't correct him. Sometimes because the things he was guessing at, I knew a future cutscene would correct for him. And I was just enjoying it with him. I did the story, he was doing it his way. It's great. So, that's my TED Talk. Let's get back to Stormblood.